This is a video on our first reading of the semester, which is an introduction to microeconomics. In this module, I'll try to be clear about, testing on just general concepts and issues, definitions within microeconomics, rather than testing on questions which would appear on a microeconomics, Principles of Microeconomics 202 exam. Right. To start out with, what's economics just in general and why is it important? And we can distinguish between micro and macroeconomics. Both sort of study this idea of scarcity, which means simply that there are more human wants for goods and services than there are available resources. And so economists study trade-offs associated with resource allocation and use. Microeconomics studies resource allocation and use sort of at the individual or firms treated as individual decision makers. So we study them at that level. And then macroeconomics studies more of the economy as the whole, consumer and producer behavior in the aggregate. All right, but in each case, it's a study of scarcity. There are more wants for goods and services than there are available resources. And then in this class, we'll also focus on how do economists go about measuring scarcity or measuring resources and resource use. So especially in our discussions, which will be a separate video that I'll post, we'll look at some individual web pages and news readings, kind of current events, look at how do economists study these issues in reality. Okay, so we start out with, we know since resources are scarce, we need to figure out the best allocation and production decisions. So Adam Smith, a name you might have heard before, wrote a book called Wealth of Nations in which he studies or talks about specialization. Smith estimates that because of specialization or through specialization, a group of laborers, each doing specialized tasks, or focusing on one group or small tasks, can produce thousands of times more output than if each individual went through every step of the production process by themselves. So the famous example that Smith gave is the pin maker. He counted 18 different tasks required for the production of a pin, cutting metal, sharpening, flattening an end, so on. And so Smith writes that the pin makers, if each focuses on one or maybe two of those distinct tasks, they can produce many more pins than if each does all of the tasks individually. So that's what specialization is, focusing on one individual task. You might consider like a factory assembly line where everybody is doing an individual task, but there's also other modern examples of specializing. So think to yourself, how in different professions or lines of work do people specialize in labor these days? All right, specialization allows people, again, to focus on the tasks where they have a advantage in skill or productivity. So, why does the division of labor increase production? Well, we can specialize in what we're good at. Once we specialize, we can gain knowledge or insights for productivity. And then we also have in economics this idea called economies of scale, which means that there are some products which, as we scale up production or produce more, it's actually cheaper to produce. So, some things like electricity and railroads, they're very expensive to put in a power plant or lay down the railroad lines. But then once you have all the infrastructure built, maybe relatively cheaper to produce more or scale up the quantity of service. So that's what economies of scale is. And so in total, when workers focus on their preferences and talents, learn to do specialized jobs better and work in larger organizations, the argument is society can produce more and consume more than if each person just tried to produce all of their own goods and services. Right, so this is the idea sort of economics just in general. And again, we study microeconomics, the individuals, and macroeconomics, kind of everybody put together. And we'll start with microeconomics. So microeconomics relates to individual choice. We'll study a little bit of consumer choice, and we'll also relate to production choices of firms. So each of those are sort of economic individual decision makers: the consumer, which chooses what to consume given an income, and the producer, which chooses what to produce given some sort of cost to produce and perhaps market prices. Right, so let's focus on the consumer. When you're a consumer, you have some sort of constraints over your consumption. So you might know, well, for now, assume that you know what you want to buy. How do you choose what to buy? To make this decision, we start with what's called a budget constraint. Something that you're casually familiar with, most of you, even if you haven't studied it in economics. Right? Everybody faces budgeting decisions. So we have this hypothetical person, Alfonso, here, who has a budget of $10 and wants to choose how many burgers or bus tickets to buy. Burgers cost $2 each, and tickets cost 50 cents each. Right, so the budget constraint here, this graph is showing us all of the possible purchases, these points A, B, C, D through F, all are possible combinations of burgers and bus tickets that Alfonso could buy. In particular, how do we map out this budget constraint? And this is one of those things I want to be clear, in a 202 class, or once you get into the intermediate classes, you would have to actually graph out these budget constraints. I'm not going to ask you graphing type questions on our little content quizzes, more identify a budget constraint and what it's showing. All right, so what's this budget constraint and what's it showing? It's showing all the possible combinations that Alfonso can purchase with this $10 budget. So what is it showing here? Well, we have burgers on the y-axis, and let's look at this point A. What is this point A telling us? That's 5 burgers and no bus tickets. Right, so what this point is telling us is, okay, if Alfonso spent all of his $10 on burgers at $2 a burger, how many burgers could he buy? 5. That's point A. All right, likewise down here for point F, if Alfonso spent his entire budget on bus tickets at 50 cents a ticket, how many could he buy? 20. So those are the endpoints of the budget constraint. Right? A shows the point where Alfonso spends all of his money on burgers. F shows the point where Alfonso spends all of his money on bus tickets. And these points in between show points where Alfonso is spending all of his money on either burgers or bus tickets in some combination. Right? So point B, 4 burgers at $2 a burger is 8. Plus 4 bus tickets means that Alfonso's spending all $10 there, and so on. All right, so the budget constraint, this shows essentially the limit of combinations of purchases that Alfonso can make. Yeah, we can move on to opportunity costs. So because Alfonso can't purchase infinitely, perhaps can't purchase everything that he wants, Alfonso is constrained to this budget set with a budget of $10. Alfonso faces opportunity costs. All right, so in economics, we can measure opportunity costs in terms of relative prices. So, if Alfonso wants a burger, how many bus tickets does he have to give up? Well, burgers cost $2. Bus tickets cost 50 cents. So he has to give up, 1/4 of a burger to afford 1 bus ticket, or he would have to give up 4 bus tickets to afford 1 burger. Right, so again, as you move, hopefully we'll get you interested in this class. You would move into 202 where you would make kind of these calculations. I'm more interested in you being able to identify the definition of opportunity cost. What is an opportunity cost? Well, when you purchase something, you could have purchased something else. All right, so how do we know what we want and what we like? This is an idea called utility. we might just take it for granted that we know what we want to purchase, but we might also want to measure what we like to purchase. So utility is subjective and it depends on individual preferences, but as you get into the later classes, you'll see that often utility is just specified given some sort of functional form. Okay, we won't specify functional forms and do calculations with them in here. Instead, we'll just think about utility in general as a mathematical concept of individual preferences. How much do you like stuff? We also have this idea of marginal utility, or how much happiness or utility you'll get from the next unit or one extra unit of consumption. And in economics, we tend to think that marginal utility decreases at a certain point. So as you consume more of a good, the amount of extra utility you get from consuming more is diminishing. A classic example is pizza, right? As you eat 1, 2 pizza slices, maybe each of those is increasing your utility by a lot, get a lot of happiness from it. But as you get 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pizza slices, each additional pizza slice, assuming you have some limit on your appetite, is worth a little bit less to you. You've already had some pizza, maybe you want something else to go with your pizza instead. Right, this is decreasing marginal utility. All right, so that was the consumer side. And as always, feel free to shoot me an email. Let me know if you want more in-depth explanation of any of these definitions. I'll be asking kind of more broad conceptual questions on our content quizzes, and I will put out a review guide before that happens. Right, so on the producer side, we also have sort of like a production constraint, similar to how we had a budget constraint for the consumer. Now we're thinking about the producer, and well, the producer only has a certain amount of resources available for production. And so given the certain amount of resources available for production, there are different combinations that are possible to produce. Right, so we call this a production possibilities curve or frontier. PPC or PPF means the same thing. We're mapping out all of the different production possibilities given the resources we have in our economy. Again, we can look at the endpoints here. Point A is a point where we're putting all of our resources into healthcare and 0 into education. Point F, we're doing 0 healthcare and all of it into education. And then there's some possible combinations in between given the resources that we have. Right, so production budget, basically, or production constraint. It's assumed that the PPF is going to be downward sloping like this, so that in order to get more education, suppose we start here, in order to get some education, we're going to have to give up some of the resources we're spending on healthcare. So once again, we have a trade-off. Now, unlike the budget constraint, the PPF is not necessarily a straight line, and that's just because in the case of the budget constraint here, look at this, the prices were constant. So because we had constant prices, the trade-off, how many burgers you would have to give up for a bus ticket or how many bus tickets you have to give up for a burger, it never changes. And so we get a straight line for this constraint. The production possibilities curve or frontier could be a straight line if trade-offs were always the same or if prices in that sense were always set. But it could be that the trade-off between resources on healthcare and education is not always the same, no matter how much we have. And so we might have also this sort of bowed downward slope. Right, but the main takeaway here is that, first of all, what does the PPF show? It shows us all the production possibilities. And why is it downward sloping? Because trade-offs. We have limited resources, and so from, say, point A to get to point B, which has more education, we would need to give up some resources spent on healthcare. All right, we, similar to the law of diminishing marginal utility, we have the diminishing marginal returns law, which means basically just that as we spend more resources on a particular good or particular production, we can produce a little bit less, or the additional resources spent on it are less beneficial, right? So once again, that gives us this bowed shape of the production possibilities, right? From point A, we can give up just a little bit of healthcare and get quite a bit of education. But over here at point D, in order to get any more education, D to F is not very much more education, but we had to give up a lot of healthcare. Right, so this bowed shape shows the law of diminishing marginal returns. As we spend more resources on a certain good or service, those resources become less and less valuable to add more resources. Right, once you've hired 1,000 teachers, the 1,001st teacher is much less valuable than if you have 0 teachers and you hire 1. Right, we can also talk about efficiency here in both the case of the budget constraint and the production constraint. So we would call any point on this production possibilities frontier efficient. It just means we're using all of the resources we have available. In here, a point like point I we would call inefficient because we could use our resources to produce more stuff, right? B or D or anywhere on these production possibilities frontier. So inside the PPF, inefficient, and outside of the PPF is unattainable. We might like to produce this much stuff, but we can't. Right, and we can relate that back to our budget constraint too, same idea. Spending all of the money. In this model, we have no role for savings yet. So here we spend all of our money inside of the budget constraint. Say if we bought 1 burger and 1 bus ticket, we're not spending all of our money. So we could buy more stuff and become more happy. And stuff outside of the budget constraint, like buying 10 burgers, is unattainable or not feasible. Right, so same idea in both cases. On the constraint is efficient. Inside it is inefficient. We could either produce or purchase more in the consumer case. Outside is unattainable. Right. So next we move on to the idea of individual supply and demand. Again, we're not going to focus in this class on actually creating graphs, manipulating the graphs. Instead, we'll focus just on sort of what these ideas are broadly. Right, so demand shows us at any particular price, so we have these prices, what is the quantity which consumers would like to buy? We could do it for an individual, that'd be an individual demand curve, or usually we refer to the entire market. So, an individual is not probably consuming 400 million gallons of gas, even in the modern hoarding economy. But as an economy, the market demand is about this, right? So at any particular price, how many will be sold? It's also going to be downward sloping due to the law of demand, which simply tells us that all else equal, consumers want to purchase more, a higher quantity at a lower price. So what's the downward slope of demand? As price falls, quantity demanded rises. Right, there are some special cases. We won't really focus on them on this class very much, but could be possible where the quantity demanded or supplied is always set and never changes. So that's an interesting special case to look at. Right, factors which shift demand, again, not going to have you, identify them from a list or things like that, which are 202 questions, but instead we just want you to see what would a demand increase or decrease look like. A demand increase is going to be a shift to the right. And there's these various factors which are going to influence the consumer and what the consumer wants to buy. A demand decrease is to the left. So here, the increase at every price, let's pick a price like this, there's a higher quantity demanded. Over here, for the demand decrease, at every price, there's a lower quantity demanded. Right. Again, the factors which shift demand are going to be factors which matter to the consumer. So tastes and preferences, the number of buyers we have, income, prices of other goods you could buy, substitutes or complements, and future expectations. Again, this list is more of a 202 topic once you get into the principles. We're focusing here more on what is a demand increase, decrease, what is the demand curve in general showing. All right, so what's the demand curve in general show? One more time, as the price increases, quantity, well, as the price decreases, quantity increases, or at higher prices, consumers would want to buy less. So there's our demand curve. Demand increase means that at every price, a higher quantity is demanded. A demand decrease means that at a demand increase means that at every price, a higher quantity is demanded. A demand decrease means that at every price, a lower quantity is demanded. Right, we have similarly producer supply. This shows us at every price how many will be supplied in the market. And conversely to demand, as the price goes up now, more suppliers will want to sell. So we have an upward slope of demand, of supply, which is our law of supply. Our law of supply says all else equal, producers want to sell more at a higher price. So we get this upward slope of supply. Could be that supply never changes in particular cases. Those are interesting ones to study, but we won't really focus on it here. Instead, we just want to know what the supply curve is showing us. It's showing us the quantity supplied at each price. And then we can think about shifts of supply. So factors which shift supply are going to be factors which a supplier or producer would care about. So production conditions, input prices, technology, taxes, subsidy, and regulations. We should also have future expectations on here, but again, not going to test on this list. Instead, we just want to know conceptually what supply is telling us and what an increase and decrease would look like. So here's a supply increase shifting to the right. And what's that tell us? Pick any price. At any price, there's a higher quantity supplied. Right, here's a supply decrease. Supply decrease shows us that at any price, there's a lower quantity supplied. Shift to the left. Okay, so what's the supply show us? Supply shows us at any price, what is the quantity supplied? Increase is when at any price there's a higher quantity supplied, decrease, a lower quantity supplied. So finally, we can focus on equilibrium and what we call the ceteris paribus assumption. Equilibrium is a price at which quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. And so we can see a couple examples here. Here's an initial equilibrium with this initial supply and initial demand. And then if supply here shifts, this is an increase, right? Because there's a higher quantity at each price supplied. So supply increases, and we have these effects on price and quantity in the market. Okay, so again, I'm not going to have you create these graphs and work with the actual numbers on them, finding prices and quantities after the supply shift. That's distinctly a 202 type question. Instead, we want to know what an equilibrium is. An equilibrium is a price at which quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. And then we also want to know that ceteris paribus, or all else equal, a shift in the supply or demand curve will change prices and quantities. So that's the end of our microeconomics video. Please reach out if you have any questions. I don't have set office hours, but I will try to answer emails as quickly as I'm able.